Yeah, so here we are testing. 1, 2, 3, testing. Welcome to live broadcast. It's Sunday night in Toronto. It's just a delay though, right? Okay.
Well, the guy took it say that man walked with him. So now he has $2.
How's it going?
Chris, how are
Good to see you. I'm
Good
well.
to see you.
Didn't
Oh
want to
my
miss the
goodness. Robert, good to see you. Thanks for
lecture.
coming.
Oh, why?
If there was not your speech, I wouldn't have come. But you know, I said I cannot resist
Well,
it.
thank you. Thank you.
Oh, you
Yeah, well,
it's connected. You only
oh, yeah. It's 6 o'clock.
Oh, do I have to announce you?
Well, we should have something that, or do you shall just throw myself out to the wolves?
Charlie's right there.
Maybe Dorothy will do it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Susan also wants to see it.
Loaded up the link to
Did
So
someone
we are
tell
live.
Gia?
yeah, recently.
Okay. So do I need to do anything?
No.
Okay.
So it's live, it's there, people
Yeah,
use it.
live.
Okay.
Live. People are
It's-
going to watch me right now as I
Yeah.
come on the screen. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're on.
Okay. Hello. Hello. So this is part 2 of our lecture series. We can all hear Richard speaking at the back of the room already. So if you didn't have an opportunity to come to the last lecture, this is the second one, and Ross put on an amazing lecture series the last time around, and we thought that this was only apropos because, as you could probably see at this point, there are a number of silver lots in our upcoming auctions this week. So the focus on the lecture tonight is taking place tomorrow night at 6 p.m. and it's all about the history of Canadian silver. If you had a chance to preview the sale, there's catalogs that are available, and as Ross will say, this is probably
in New France. Unfortunately, most of the silversmiths that came in the 17th century are known only to us by name. And we know of their names because of the research that was done by important sociologists, mostly in the 20th century, people like Marius Barbeau, Gérard Morisset, Ramsay Tréquier. These are people that were doing research on site, connecting documents that they were reading in parish churches, militia lists, identifying silversmiths by name, and then identifying the makers of the objects. Because in Canada, we never had guilds, we did not have assay offices. So when research was being done on makers in places like London, they could go to Goldsmiths Hall and look at lists. The information that we have has come down by individuals doing intensive research over a long period of time. And unfortunately, some of those people are only known by name, and they're only from these lists, and we've not been able to identify actual pieces of silver that they made. In fact, there is no piece of Canadian silver that we can say was made here specifically in the 17th century. Number of the silversmiths that actually came out to New France found life here very hard, and there was not a lot of work for them to do. And many of them left. They were all trained in France. And one of the difficulties was that there was no source of mined silver in Canada or New France at that time. There had been a hope on the behalf of Louis XIV, who was sending people over to colonize New France, that they would find vast amounts of silver like the Spanish were finding in South America. It simply didn't happen. And so we know from documentary evidence, mostly from parish records, that when pieces were commissioned, and this is now in the 18th century, they were made from damaged pieces of silver or coins. And there were vast numbers of different kinds of coins circulating in the colony. There were French coins, the French troops were paid in French silver, and silver like this would be brought to a silversmith, and he would be asked to recreate a piece. And there's one of the silversmiths. This is one of the few portraits of an 18th century silversmith that we know. This is François Renvoiset, and he was born in Canada. The first Canadian silversmith that we know born was Jacques Paget, who was born in Quebec and then trained here in Canada. And there are pieces of his work extant. But perhaps the most important silversmith of the early 18th century was Paul Lambert. He was very prolific, trained in France, worked in Quebec until 1749. And we're pleased to have one of his chalices in the collection. And there it is. I'd started to tell you a little bit about the importance of silver in the society. And we've seen the coins. That was the form of money that people used on a daily, that's what they had, was silver coins. Religious objects that were made of silver played a big role in society as well. And in 1945, Gérard Morisset wrote a monograph on Paul Lambert, and in it he said, it's impossible to understand a piece of silver by looking at it in a showcase. And he asks us to use our imaginations. And in that way, I'm just going to go back and tell a story of, perhaps about this chalice. And it's 1735, and it's cold, it's a Sunday morning. Papa has hooked the horse up to the sleigh. The children are all dressed up warmly. Not only because it's cold outside, it's not much warmer in church. They're going to church for a very special day, because for the first time, Mass is going to be celebrated with a chalice that came all the way from Quebec City. And it took the congregation over a year to save up the money to commission Paul Lambert to make this chalice. And the chalice is worth more than the building that it is in. And that's the kind of thing that we have to kind of think about. These are the things that were part of their weekly life. People would be attending Mass. They would see the priest performing the Mass ceremony using things like this. And it's hard if we are a disconnect from objects that we no longer use to understand their purpose within the society. This is a paten that came with that chalice. This particular one is French, not uncommon for chalice and patens to get mixed up, particularly as churches had more and more silver in their collections. People weren't paying attention as to which particular paten might have come with which particular chalice. So this is a French one from 1746. Canon law dictated that vessels used in the Mass, so a chalice and a ciborium, had to be made of precious metal, silver or gold. Most people could only afford silver. There are a few gold pieces. François Renvoise made a gold chalice and paten that are known. There were other objects that were used within the church, although they weren't dictated to be made of precious metals. They were. And this is a baptismal ewer. This would be used in the ceremony of pouring water on an infant for baptism. This particular one was made by Robert Cruickshank. This is this is a 19th century one by Pierre L'Espérance. L'Espérance had worked with Laurent Amiot as an apprentice and made fantastic silver. And this is a holy oil container. This would be used by a priest making visits, perhaps doing last rites or that kind of thing. So again, these are objects that people within that society would be familiar with and will have seen. Again, this is a pyx. This is used for holding the host. This would not be used during a Mass. The ciborium was used for holding the host, which would be given out to the celebrants. And this particular object, this is the kind of thing if you were having a visit at home from the priest and needed to celebrate Mass or perform some other ceremony, the host would be stored in an object like this. And this is a holy water font for blessing yourself going through a doorway. This particular one, again, is 19th century. It was made by Robert Hendry. It has an interesting group of initials, IBB, which have been attributed to Jean-Baptiste Babi. The Babi family were an incredibly important family in the fur trade industry, and they were also known from documentary records, particularly wills and probate, to have had lots of silver. And there are other pieces known that came through the Babi connection. And these are things that were worn by nuns. The Sacred Heart and this particular cross, these open up and they could hold a little relic, but they were worn by all of the nuns in Quebec. This particular one is by Pierre L'Espérance. Although we are not offering this piece, it's important to show it to you, and there is a connection to Pierre L'Espérance. This silver mortar was made by Paul Lambert. It's a very rare item in silver, let alone Canadian silver. In the 19th century, in the 1870s, a group of nuns in Quebec gave this mortar to Pierre L'Espérance and said, make us a bunch of these. And this is one of the problems in Canadian silver, is that these things get recycled. Why do we still have it? The then Governor General, the Marquis of Lorraine, was visiting the nuns. For some reason, they mentioned this to him. He was married to one of the daughters of Queen Victoria. She had gone back to England, and he said, well, I would never ask you, but as you have given it to Pierre L'Espérance, I'm going to buy it. So the Marquis of Lorraine bought the mortar, took it back to England as a present for his wife. again, this is, remember, this is in, that would have been 1881 or 2 when he left Canada. It showed up for sale in London in the 1940s. It eventually ended up in the Henry Burke's collection. So it got repatriated, and we still have it. But it was that close to being melted down.
Wow.
One of the other important uses of silver within New France society were things like this. This is a piece of trade silver, sometimes called Indian trade silver. And the earliest reference to trade silver were pieces that we know were being made by François Delezin, and he was a Quebec silversmith in the mid-18th century. And these were things that were used by the Montreal, Quebec-based silversmiths, and latterly in Detroit. As the fur trade moved further and further west, it bypassed Toronto. Toronto was not involved in it because the fur trade had already moved that far west that some silversmiths had migrated to as far as Detroit. This particular one, as you can see, was made by Robert Cruickshank. And Robert Cruickshank was part of a wave of English silversmiths that came to Canada after the conquest and also the War of Independence in the United States. And he was in Montreal by 1775 at the very latest. And this was an incredibly important part of the New France fur trade experience. Not so with the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company was a rival to the Northwest Company, which came after the French fur traders. And they worked out of factories that were based out of, obviously, Hudson's Bay. And they were in competition with the Northwest Company. And so they did not use a lot of trade silver. But to give you an idea of how many pieces, remember, these are being made from melted down Spanish coins or other coins. We have documentary evidence for one order that was placed with Robert Cruickshank for over 24,000 pieces of trade silver. One order for 1 year for one silversmith. Now, part of that order was 12,000 ear bobs, but there was, part of the order was 100 crosses. And there were other things, Luckenbooth brooches and other pieces. And so thousands and thousands of these pieces were made. And again, that was part of the culture. Everyone that was involved in the fur trade would have been aware of the use and value of these pieces. And when you consider how scant and scarce silver was, it was a lot of silver that was being used in that industry. This is a nice example of the other piece of silver that we have from the New France period. And at this point, I'll go back to Gerard Morisset and share that little story that he included in the Paul Lambert monologue. So he talked about looking at an object, not in a showcase, but thinking. And he talks about imagining the family, mother and father at either end of the table, the ancestors looking down, the children seated around the table, all the silver cutlery, forks and spoons, bowls, dishes. Some of the smaller ones may be made out of pewter, not necessarily all silver. And the part that I like the most is when he's talking about the soup ladle, and he says, and there's the vast soup tureen, witness to their large appetites. It's a wonderful story. But it helps us to think about, again, another aspect of silver being used in that society. This one is by François Lefebvre. This mark is not recorded, but it is in a document that was produced by Robert Derome in 1974 as an adjunct to a very important exhibition that took place that was curated by Jean Trudel, and it was called Silver in New France, and it included French silver and Canadian silver. The book that Derome published was a complete list of what he could find of documentary evidence. Every time he found a silversmith referred to in a will or a marriage certificate or a business arrangement. So under somebody, say like Francois Delezin, there's a reference there of him hiring a freed slave for wages to come and work for him as a silversmith. And in that particular book, there's an entry for Lefebvre, and he describes this mark. He didn't have a piece to show the mark, but he described it. And so even though this had been sold in another sale room with a different designation, I'm deferring to Jerome, and if anyone disagrees, they can take it up with him. This is another piece of domestic silver. Again, we'll think back to that lovely dining room table, the family sitting around it. There would have been small beakers like this for drinking out of. This one is by Francois Renvoise, very typical to French tumbler cups or thimble cups of the same era. Renvoise, there was a very romantic idealization of Renvoise in the early 20th century. People were in awe of him. And I think that partly that was a romantic feeling because he had been born in the Ancien Regime. He was the most important continuity, or provided the most important continuity in silversmithing after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and of course the English taking over. He still made silver in the French style. He was very much eclipsed, both technically and stylistically, by Laurent Amiot, and I'll talk about Amiot in a moment. This is another Amiot. This is the older brother of Laurent Amiot. This is Jean-Nicolas, and this is in the shape of a tasse de vin, but it's a larger example. And I believe these were multi-purpose objects. They were used both for drinking and for eating out of. And again, this one has IBB, Jean-Baptiste Baby. It is spelled B-A-B-Y, but it's pronounced Babi. And if you were ever over in Babi Point, it's not Baby Point. His older brother, Jacques Babi, was born in Detroit in 1763. He came to Toronto and changed his name to James, and that's the Babi that Babi Point is named after. Here we have a magnificent soup ladle by Amiot. This is Laurent Amiot. And Amiot was born a year after the Treaty of Paris. So he was born in 1764 as a young man, probably working with his brother, Jean-Nicolas, showing promise. Arrangements were made for him to go back to France. And remember, this is already now post-Ancien Regime. English, the English are taking over control. But he went back to France. He worked as an apprentice in Paris for 5 years. We don't know with whom he did that, but he was there. Letters went back and forth, and he came back to Quebec in 1787. And he completely changed silversmithing in Quebec. Artisans at that time had been looking inward and backward. They were trying to hold on to the French look and aspect of their lives, even though, the country was now dominated by England. And that's why Renvoise continued to make silver in the way that he had always made it. But when Amiot came back, his technique was so much better. He was trained so well, and he was able to incorporate different aspects, not just French aspects, but he could make silver that was influenced by English ceramics and other sources. This is a very interesting little thimble cup. This one is by Robert Cruickshank, and our very own astute Andrea discovered that this one is in fact the very one that is photographed in John Langdon's book. This particular form with this slightly inverted bottom and slightly flared top is very much a Montreal thing. It's different from the American examples. It's different from the French examples. It very much has a Montreal look. Cruickshank went back to England in 1807, and he was coming back to Canada in 1809 and died on board a ship. And so effectively his working dates end in 1807. This is a very interesting example of a colonial piece. So here we have a baluster can made by Peter Bolle of German extraction in Montreal. I've put it next to this can. This is made in the Channel Islands, mid-18th century. So this is very much a George II form, is when these balusters came into being used both, in England. You find them in, obviously, in the Channel Islands. The reason that I want to point this out, and they were made in the United States as well. Look at the bottoms. You see how much bigger this one is?
Oh, yeah.
He didn't quite understand the proportions. And if you want to see one of these being made, there's a wonderful video that was made in colonial Williamsburg where they show the making of a can, and they also show this being cast. So this was cast in a sand mold, whereas this one was raised from a flat sheet. And probably Bolle didn't have access to be able to cast that. He's raised this, didn't get the proportions quite right. And it's, just a little charming kind of colonial attribution. And this is a lovely bowl. This is a Robert Cruickshank piece, dated late 1790s. And if you look at the way that the monogram is done in this shield, it echoes exactly what we're seeing on Chinese export silver, Chinese export porcelain of that time, painted in exactly the same way. This has another little crest on the back as well. Another Robert Cruickshank piece. You'd think, oh, typical helmet creamer, but again, there are some colonial variations. This foot is raised, it's a little broader and a little taller. He's added this beautiful strap handle, which mimics the prickwork and engraving underneath the rim, and it goes down the back of the handle. And again, a lovely period initials marked 3 times in the base. And this is a very rare example. This is a brandy warmer by Amiot, dating from 1795, 1800. What's interesting about this, it's an example of how silver travels. Silver's portable, and we think of people coming across the ocean. We hear about these horrific journeys that took months on end. People came to Canada and oh, how horrible it was in the winters. But people travel a lot more than we realize. People came to Canada, they went back to France, they went to the Caribbean, and in the English period we had colonial officials, we had military people. Silver was ordered here and it traveled. This piece, ended up in New York at some time and has an inscription for Robert Armstrong Livingston, who was born in New York in 1854, and that's engraved on it. And this was discovered in New York at a show in the 1990s. But to give you an example, and again, this is all workshop period, but as we move into the factory period, one of the first people to produce pattern flatware in Canada was Peter Nordbeck in Halifax. And I know of 2 flatware sets in King's pattern that Nordbeck was advertising as early as 1832. One of these sets showed up in South Africa and was repatriated and sold in Toronto. And another set appeared in England, and that's been repatriated and is in Montreal. So these things traveled extensively. And the Cruickshank bowl that we just saw, that also was discovered in New York. Joseph Sasseville, another silversmith, his younger brother Francois went on to be much more successful and better known. But a lovely little box, navette shaped, late 18th century design. So this is, circa 1800. We can be generous and around there. It could be a little later. But again, snuff boxes were part of society at that time, and they showed up here as well. Here we have a lovely little mustard pot, Peter Nordbeck, again, a Halifax silversmith. I'll just talk a little bit about the two waves of silversmiths that came to Canada. So of course we have the first wave that comes over with French settlers, and as I said, they mostly settled in Quebec and Montreal. Some went to Detroit and then came back. And then we get that second wave post 1759, and also with the creation, of course, the founding of Halifax in the 1740s. There was a vast wave of people leaving during the War of Independence. We had as many as 10 silversmiths showing up in Nova Scotia in, I'm going to forget the name of the town, it's on the South Shore. Which one was it, Robert, down the South Shore? Oh, thank you. See, this is why I have help in the audience. He's not shilling, there was as many as 10 silversmiths listed in the 1780s in this tiny village of Shelburne. Well, obviously, there was not enough work for them all, and most of them scattered to the four winds. Nordbeck was an early 19th century silversmith, but even then things were changing. You know, there was never any trade silver, for instance, made in the maritime provinces. That was very much a Quebec and Detroit thing. So also church silver was not made to the extent it was in Quebec, because there's not as much silver used in the Protestant tradition as there was in the Roman Catholic tradition. What we find, though, is more domestic silver and presentation silver. And presentation silver is something that is kind of lacking in this collection, and it's more of a 19th century thing that came during the factory period. Here we have a magnificent entree dish. This one marked Savage and Lyman & Co. And Savage and Lyman & Co. were retailers only. They would bring in silver, and most of everything that they sold was made by Robert Hendry and later the partnership of Hendry and Leslie. What's interesting about this entree dish is its mate is in the McCord Museum in Montreal. Our lid and bottom are numbered 1 and 2, and they have 2 and 1. You'd think we could, you know, it'll never happen. Too much bureaucracy. I'll just go back to this for a minute. Savage and Lyman went out of business in 1879. Their business plummeted after the British Army pulled out. After we had Confederation in 1867, they were, you know, huge buyers of silver, and they simply just couldn't continue because a lot of their customers had left the country. There was a young man who had started working for that firm by the name of Henry Burks, and he was involved in wrapping up this company, and lo and behold, started his own company, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And here we are into some domestic silver. I wanted to show this as a transition. Despite the handwork that you see on this piece, this is the early factory marks of Robert Hendry. This is hand decorated, but we're now into a more of a factory setting. He's mass producing, and I use that word loosely, but you know, they're not just one-offs. They were making this type of cup. And in fact, this one is almost completely machine made. It's done on a lathe. This top lip is turned over on its edge. It's hollow. This beading is done mechanically. This is a hollow stamping. So we're seeing a change now from handmade workshop silver into the factory era. But still, in the 19th century, you do get individual smiths making things by hand. And this is a magnificent example of a child's cup, and very rare in Canadian silver to find what I would refer to as novelty silver. This obviously made to look like a barrel. This is made by Poulin in Quebec. And he also made this magnificent little bracelet, you know, and it's small, obviously for a child. And if you look at the figures, there's another one in gold. These are storybook figures, and the one in gold and this one particularly are like the Kate Greenaway figures of that era. I haven't had time to identify some of the others, but there are definitely children's storybook figures, and they're magnificent pieces. This is an interesting piece. This turned up at auction in Toronto and was bought by another astute gentleman who was at the back of the room. And What's intriguing about this piece is that it's by Robert Cruickshank. But let's look at the marks. These are the marks on the back of the ladle, and you can. Oh, did I lose my? Sorry. Thank you. If we look at the marks, you can very clearly see Robert Cruickshank's mark struck twice, and then underneath was the word Montreal. This has been overstruck with marks for a retailer in Toronto, J.G. Joseph and Company. And we know that all his flatware was produced by Robert Hendry. So it must have come from the Hendry factory. There is the J.G. Joseph mark. This is on a fiddle and thread pair of ladles that we have. But these were all produced at the Robert Hendry factory in Montreal. So perhaps this turned up there and Joseph needed a ladle for a customer and simply they overstruck it, struck the J.G. Joseph. And it's not, this is not the first, the only instance. Here again is another set of spoons. This was marked UC Club, which is, it's in the Langdon book, but again, overstruck with the same marks used by J.G. Joseph. Quite an oddity, but totally legit. And this is a very fun piece. It's a little snowshoe pin. Snowshoeing was, again, it was a part of people's lives. People used snowshoes. It wasn't just recreation. They needed them to get from point A to point B. And there were international races between snowshoers in Quebec and particularly Vermont. There were different kinds of snowshoe races. There were endurance races, long distance races. This one is showing a steeplechase. So they are literally jumping over steeples with their snowshoes on. And this is probably a club pin. I've seen some other pins. And these were all produced by the Thomas Allen Company of Montreal. And this advertisement and the previous picture come out of this catalog for the 1883 Montreal Winter Carnival. And although the little pin is not marked, it is clearly from the company of Thomas Allen and Co. They produced a number of these things, these little snowshoe tie pins and other pins. And I actually have a little collection of novelty salt spoons that I'm sure that they produce some of them because they are exactly like this, but in the form of a spoon. We're jumping ahead a little bit now and kind of still in the factory era, but moving a bit more into the studio area. And again, I'm sorry, we're still in Quebec, so and there's a couple Maritimers in the room. I have to apologize. Don't blame me. It's in the collection, and there's just not that much maritime silver to talk about. This is a silver chalice by Jules Beaugrand, a fantastic silversmith who worked in Montreal and was producing really high quality silver. And he is competing with companies. There was another company in Toronto, Emerson Houghton. They were producers of ecclesiastical silver, but more in the Protestant tradition. We do have a piece by Houghton in the sale on Monday that does not appear in their catalog. Somebody at the firm, it could have been Houghton himself, made handmade pieces of silver. And to some degree, Beaugrand's pieces are made more in that handmade silversmithing tradition. And at the same time, we have Paul Peterson, trained in Denmark, comes to Canada, sets himself up in Montreal. And the interesting thing is, here are the two comports that I'm talking about. This one is the one by Emerson Houghton. And the interesting thing about this one is it also has a retail mark for Mappin in Montreal. So clearly there was a connection between that firm and Montreal. Montreal was the leading city of Canada well into the 20th century. Some may claim it still is, but I'm not about to argue that. But here we have Peterson, and very much in the Scandinavian style and in being influenced by things happening in Denmark, Scandinavia, silver and furniture and jewelry. What's interesting about Peterson is that if you look at his mark, he has the word handmade underneath his punch. And a great deal of what Peterson produced was mechanically made. There was some assembly by hand, but he was a businessman. He was producing silver in large quantities. You know, he would put an order for a 1/4 ton of silver in with Johnson Matthey at a time. He produced large flatware sets. He had a big clientele in the United States. And so to say that his pieces were handmade is a little bit naughty. And so, yes, we're coming to some indigenous pieces. The Haida on the West Coast were some of the few indigenous people in Canada anyway, to use the medium of silver from an early date. There was a great deal of misunderstanding about trade silver. You find it written up in books in the early part of the 20th century where they refer to it as being native made. Well, it clearly was not. They didn't have the tools or the tradition. But on the West Coast they did, and they were able to translate some of their wood carving into silver objects. And of course, Bill Reed is the greatest proponent of that art form. And here again, we're moving into the studio era. And why do I call it the studio era? So we've gone from the workshop era, where silver that was made was part of people's everyday lives. Then it begins to be made in factories. And we had multiple factories in Canada. And as silver has fallen out of use in people's everyday lives, silver has really become a kind of a luxury thing. Most people, when they hear I'm a silversmith, are amazed that they still exist. This particular piece, I made a series of martini glasses. I had a friend, Lorraine Turner, who was a silver specialist at Bonham's, and she started running sales post-1945 design of silver. And she said, send me some pieces. I mean, I did. And at least 2 of them have been repatriated. This piece and a sauce boat. And this is an interesting piece, and it is one of the things that when we talk about Canadian silver, we have to remember that the last book that was published with silver marks in it was published in 1974, and that was the Durham book. There was a book of maritime silversmiths marks that came out in 1973, the Donald Mackay book. Before that was John Langdon in the 1960s, and basically his research was done prior to the Second World War. And a great deal has happened since then, not just in the study of Canadian silver, but colonial silver, silver in places like South Africa, Channel Islands, also Scottish provincial silver. And this particular piece has come down from a long list of people being attributed as being Canadian. The reason being that the initials shown here, AGW, happen to coincide with an entry that John Langdon made in his book for Arthur Wiseman, Quebec, circa 1865. I'm going to come back to this. This is a nutmeg grater. It's unusual for a number of reasons: its size and the fact that it's on feet. Nutmeg graters were very much an object of the late 18th century. They were mostly pocket pieces. People carried them as an individual personal item. You'd go out dining, restaurant, somebody's house. You wanted to season your food. You could grate your own nutmeg and season your food to your taste. So very unusual to find one as feet. And that's why I refer to it as a table nutmeg grater. This bothered me a great deal when it came in with this attribution. So this has come from a well-known dealer with this attribution. It went through another auction house with this attribution. But 1865 just doesn't ring true. And it's a case in point of when you're looking at any kind of artwork, a painting, you don't just look at the signature, you have to look at the piece. And it bothered me, and I continued to research it, and I apologize for the quality of this photograph, but you can clearly see this is the same punch. AHW. And I had suspicions that that piece was Scottish provincial. That's what that other mark showed up on. There is nothing more Scottish than a sporran. I found this in Australia, and it clearly confirms what I think as being a Scottish provincial piece. So although even here there is no attribution, and that set of initials does not appear in any of the Scottish provincial literature yet, I'm sure someday somebody will nail that down. I'm going to end with this piece and give you some facts and figures. You know, we don't see a lot of Canadian silver. This is the best collection to come on the market since 1979. Where has it all gone? Well, in 1979, Henry Burks, who'd been collecting silver since 1936, donated his collection of 7,000 pieces to the National Gallery of Canada. They were not all magnificent chalices and ciboriums. Included in that, of course, is a great deal of flatware. There were tools from the Henry and Leslie factory, punches. There's a collection of mostly flatware and spoons that John Langdon donated to the Royal Ontario Museum, 500 pieces. So where is it all? And the thing is, it's still out there. And the reason that I know it's still out there, this spoon has the crest of Joseph Gaspard Chosgros de Liry. The Chosgros de Liry family were incredibly important in New France. His father was the chief engineer and involved in building military establishments. This particular Chosgros de Liry was also a military engineer. What's important is that he left a list of the silver that he bought over his lifetime. In that list are 112 pieces. This is the only one known out of that list of 112 pieces. It's a French ragout spoon, and it was found in Ontario by a person that some people here know. Ron Boyce passed away now, but Ron Boyce discovered this at a small auction in Ontario, donated to the National Gallery. And I'm showing this to you to encourage you to think that somewhere there are all the other pieces that bear the Chosgros de Liry crest. And it's not the only one. I know of a service plate that came from the Joseph Louis Godefroy de Tannencourt service, some of which ended up in the Detroit Institute. That plate showed up in Toronto. So out there, there are many pieces of silver from the Ancien regime, from other silversmiths. There are other pieces that have yet to be identified. They're out there. We're fortunate enough that you don't have to go searching tomorrow because they're right here. Thank you very much. I'm happy to field questions if there's anything anyone would like to ask about the lecture or about the silver that we have for sale.
Yeah, my question is, when they did the mold, were they concerned about its perfect shape? Like some of the pieces, to me, weren't perfect, or...
Yeah, you have to realize that these were being made in workshops where there was no electric lighting. Okay. They were made entirely by hand. They did not have gas torches. They were using charcoal-fired torches with bellows to heat them up. The process was quite different. The fact that they're as magnificent as they are is just a testament to how good these silversmiths were. Anybody else? Yes.
When did this silver production really take off in Toronto?
So we have silversmiths starting in Toronto as early as the 1790s. Jordan Post was here and worked in Toronto into the 1800s. He was making mostly flatware. It didn't really take off until we had the firms like Ellis at the end of the 19th century and Ryrie and Roden, and they were all mass producing large objects, tea sets, punch bowls, that kind of thing. But they mostly disappeared in the post-First World War. Henry Burks was a brilliant businessman, and he bought out something like 19 different silversmithing businesses by moving into small towns, undercutting their prices and then buying them out, and essentially took over the production of most of the silver until you had people like Beaugrand making religious silver and Paul Peterson in the mid-19th century or mid-20th century.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Was silver flatware competitive with pewter?
It was not competitive at all. I'm shocked when you look at the prices. Pewter was pennies. It was very inexpensive. And things like pewter forks and spoons, cutlery, was cast in molds. It was not hammered out. This ragu spoon cost 56 pounds when Choscro de Leary added it to, and remember there were 4 of them.
Yeah.
56 pounds in the mid-18th century. These were staggering sums of money. A lot of money. So much more expensive and not competitive at all with pewter. Anybody else? Yes.
You talked about the 3 eras. So let's say the factory era.
Yes.
Did any of the individuals in the silversmith industry find a sustainable source of silver?
Yeah,
continue to use coins.
A really sustainable source of silver in America didn't appear to the discovery of the Comstock lode, which was made public in 1859 in Nevada. The owners of the Comstock lode sent a ton of silver to Tiffany's to produce silver for them, and of course that silver made its way into and there were other sources in the 19th century where you could start to buy bullion in bulk. But silver in Canada wasn't really discovered until the discovery in cobalt in 1906. And by 1910, cobalt was the 4th largest producer of silver in the world. So, yeah, but you know, they certainly all through the 18th century and into the early 19th century, they were relying on remaking old pieces and using coins. Anything else? Anybody else? Well, again, thank you very much. Please enjoy some more food and drink, and we'd be happy to show you the pieces that are coming up.